not the creation of a frontier, a border or line of separation, but the alteration of something which already existed. The events of 1773, important as they were, did not represent the end of that changing process. Instead, they laid the groundwork for further changes across the region. For one thing, the attack upon the Boone party inspired something of a panic among many settlers, who feared that this incident was a precursor for one of the most feared events that could mar the development of the West: another Indian War. It should be remembered that Britain, though victorious against France in the 7 Years' War, had been soundly defeated by a loose confederation of Indian tribes in 1763, in the conflict known as Pontiacs Rebellion. Indeed, so successful was this movement that British influence in the West was greatly diminished, and ultimately brought to something of a close by King George's Proclamation, which divided settler from Indian lands. The spectre of another Indian War thus cast a long shadow, but the murder of the Russell and Boone boys simultaneously led to calls for retribution among many. In the words of one correspondent to the Virginia Gazette, and I quote, "Should we tamely suffer those savages to be the first invaders?" End quote. Of course, this writer seems to have ignored the fact that it was the Boone party that was invading Indian lands. Not only that, they were invading Indian lands which the King of Britain had deemed off limits to his American subjects. And whereas it is just and reasonable and essential to our interest and the security of our colonies that the several nations of tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved to them, or any of them, as their hunting grounds. Royal Proclamation of 1763. By the beginning of the 1770s, covetous eyes were still looking westward with the hope of circumventing King George's problematic division of the land. Places such as Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee represented a veritable bounty of land for anyone who could gain title to these highly desired regions. Problematically, both the king and the Indians stood between these would-be speculators and the lands they sought to claim. The attack upon the Boone party, however, had significantly increased tensions in the West, and though not enough to justify a land grab war against the Indians, certain events, certain processes had now been set in motion. Among these was a growing desire among a minority of settlers to initiate violent attacks upon the Indians, retribution for the well-publicised deaths of William Russell's and Daniel Boone's sons. This led to a situation in Western Virginia in the early part of 1774 that saw a small number of very violent individuals acting as if a war of the Indians had already broken out. In particular, Michael Cresap and Daniel Greathouse were responsible for a number of attacks upon Indians, many of them friendly, as a response to the crisis triggered by the events of 1773. Over the course of the early months of 1774, the number of attacks by these rogue bands increased greatly, until they culminated in the Yellow Creek Massacre, an event which would again help to further transform the nature of the settlers' and Indians' frontier. Although Michael Cresap was blamed by Thomas Jefferson for this massacre, it was in actuality Daniel Greathouse and his followers who committed the act. Having heard rumours that the Indians were planning to attack the settlers at Yellow Creek, Greathouse and his men decided to launch a preemptive strike of their own near the end of April. Rather than attacking a war band, however, they instead lured a group of Mingo Indians, which included women and children, to the site, where they were summarily destroyed. There were even reports from some contemporaries that the fetus of one of the victims was ripped from its mother's womb and impaled upon a spike. Problematically for the settlers, Greathouse's actions all but ensured that a general war of the Indians would break out. One of the women killed during this affair was the sister of Logan, the famous Mingo peace broker who had worked ceaselessly to ease tensions between the settlers and his tribe. Faced with news that his family had been destroyed, Logan's previous belief in peace quickly disappeared to be replaced by an equal determination to punish the settlers for their crimes, and shortly after the massacre, Logan led those warriors among his band willing to follow him against their aggressors. In a famous speech the chief gave at the end of the subsequent war, he made his grievances and feelings perfectly clear. I appeal to the white man to say, if he entered Logan's cabin hungry, and he gave not meat, if he ever came cold and naked, and he clothed him not. During the course of the last long and bloody war, Logan remained idle in his cabin, an advocate for peace. Such was my love for whites, that my countrymen pointed as they passed and said, Logan is the friend of white men. I've even thought to live with you, but for the injuries of one man there runs not a drop of my blood in the veins of any living creature. This has called upon me for revenge, and I have sought it. I've killed many, and I've fully glutted my vengeance. For my country I rejoice at the beams of peace, but do not harbour a thought that mine is the joy of fear. Logan never felt fear. He will not turn on his heel to save his life. Who is there now to mourn for Logan? Not one. Logan of the Mingo, 1774. In this one speech, Logan captures some of the essential nature of that changing frontier that dominated the West at the end of the 18th century. On the one hand, the anger felt by the chief for the massacre of his family, for the betrayal of his peaceful ideals, is tangible, a reflection of that long ingrained image of frontier violence that's been presented in countless films, books and television shows. On the other hand, this speech also reflects how different the frontier could be from that long established idea. Logan speaks of peace and a lifelong mission to defend it. He speaks of brotherhood with the settlers, of empathy between the peoples of the frontier, and even a desire, at least to a certain extent, to integrate them. He also speaks of division and nuance amongst the Indians. According to Logan, he wasn't interested in fighting the settlers during the 7 Years' War or Pontiacs Rebellion. But he also speaks of change, of transformation, and the end of a relatively restrained period of frontier interaction. He speaks of massacres, of the desire for revenge, and of his personal transformation. Less obvious, but no less important, is Logan's demonstration that the changing nature of life on the frontier during this time was making the maintenance of peace a much more difficult prospect. With unrestrained attacks occurring on both sides, those like Logan who previously worked to maintain peace were transformed by experience. The Mingo did not just lose a key peace broker when Logan turned upon his values, they gained a proactive war chief. Whereas the frontier had previously been an opportunity for Logan to engage in peaceful contact with white settlers, following the Yellow Creek massacre, it became something else entirely. To compound matters, Logan's subsequent vendetta against the settlers mirrored the actions committed against his own family, resulting in a spiral of violence as settlers and Indians alike sought to settle scores. Having spiraled out of control, Logan's vendetta would ultimately draw in larger and larger numbers, including the Shawnee and Virginia's last royal governor, to create the conflict now known as Dunmore's War. But ultimately, the changing shape of the frontier in this region, from one of restrained contact to open hostilities, would lay the groundwork for some of the most violent encounters between settlers and Indians over the course of the next 20 years. The frontier, then, was not an unchanging or simple place, nor was it simply a border between peoples. Instead, it was a changing entity that adapted and altered its shape on an almost constant basis, a zone of interaction in which different groups engage in an ever-changing series of encounters and negotiations. The frontier was not merely a zone in which settlers and Indians interacted. It was a place where Indian tribes allied and competed with one another. It was a place where internal tribal divisions were expressed, where peace between the native population and the settlers was maintained, and ultimately, the place where it came to an end. The frontier did not have to be violent. Instead, a spectrum of other possibilities existed in the region, with violence between its peoples being only one possible outcome. Of course, it was violence that would ultimately come to dominate the area west of the Appalachians throughout the last quarter of the 18th century, but that violence was not necessarily inevitable. Instead, it was the result of a very specific set of circumstances and the very specific set of responses they generated. The War of the Indians was not the inevitable result of the frontier then, but the frontier did evolve in such ways to bring war about. The question, and it is an open question which we hope to deal with in the rest of the series, is why that happened. In the next episode of this podcast series, we'll be exploring why the early West was dominated by warfare with the Indians by exploring the development and story behind Dunmore's War.